We who know Rabbi Schulweis can recall moments that we sat in the synagogue and were changed by his words, that his words reoriented our understanding of God, our understanding of prayer, that the institutions he created, the programs he created, Chavurot and Para-Rabbinics and a counseling center, Jewish World Watch, Response, that these initiatives changed the way that we do synagogue. I want to step away from our personal experience for a moment and step to a higher level and ask how it was that Rabbi Schulweis is a figure in American Jewish history. And if we begin with just a quick consideration of the moment he arrived, Encino, 1970. He graduated from the Jewish Theological Seminary in May of 1950. He took 2 years to work as the youth director in Temple Beth El of Parkchester, New York, and then was called to his first major pulpit in Oakland, California in 1952. I once joked with him that, Schulweis, you were in Oakland and Berkeley during the student uprisings, the Vietnam War, the rise of the Civil Rights Movement, and the Black Panthers, and then you came to L.A. just in time for Synanon, the Watts riots. Soros follows you, Schulweis. But he was an historic figure in that sense. He came to this, so think about the historic moment when he arrives here. Encino, 1970. American Jewry has just entered its third or fourth generation. Immigrants, their children, and their children's children are moving to the San Fernando Valley and creating households and families. And they're looking for an understanding of Judaism and a way to do Judaism. And there is a certain amount of anxiety in the air. You all have seen the magazine cover from 1964. Look magazine published a cover story called The Vanishing American Jew, where the author said that by the end of the century, even by the end of the 1980s, there'll be no American Jews left, because American ethnic groups last 3 generations. And American Jews are reaching that 3rd generation. And when you transcend the generation that had Yiddish or Cambodian or Spanish or Polish or Irish-speaking grandparents, and you become fully American, you lose your identity. It becomes just a kitsch. So the author, a Harvard sociologist, said this is the end of American Judaism, 1964. It's in that context that Rabbi Schulweis arrives here. Jews are going to be different than they were before because they don't have immigrant memories. They don't speak Yiddish. They eat gefilte fish, nebuch, out of a jar. They take tradition out of a jar. So how does he understand Judaism, and how does he restructure Judaism that enables this community to thrive? And our scholar for the weekend is eminently ready to address these and many more questions. David Ellenson, professor of Jewish history here and then at UCLA, and then he became president of the Hebrew Union College, and he survived that for 10 years, and now he's back being a Jew again. He's distinguished professor of Jewish civilization at New York University, chancellor emeritus of HUC, and a dear friend of us all. Please welcome our scholar, Dr. David Ellenson.
There we go. Well, Shabbat Shalom, everybody. It is really wonderful to be here. I have to say, Rabbi Hoffman, after last night's service, and I'd actually meant to say something, I think what would be infinitely...
We have a funny microphone system. If you don't speak right into it, we can't
Okay, is this better? Okay. I'd like to say, for those of you, how many were here last night? Oh, boy, that's good, and you came back.
It's a compliment to us all.
A compliment to us all. I'd like to say that the real highlight of the service was undoubtedly the Hoffman children, beyond anything that the rabbis did. And I could say that for inspiration and perhaps also for entertainment, we could not only listen to your children sing, who, as the cantor said, represent the future, but I have a feeling that a little more investment in dance lessons and those 2 girls of yours, who knows what the future will bring. Beyonce's daughter, Blue Ivy, has nothing over them. I am certain. But it is really a great, great pleasure for me to be here today. And again, I want to thank Rabbi Feinstein, Malka, the Schulweis family for inviting me to be here and to think about Rabbi Schulweis and his legacy. And this morning, what I'd like to focus on over the next 35 to 40 minutes, and hopefully there'll be time for discussion and questions, is really the legacy that Rabbi Schulweis left for American Judaism, the directions that he pioneered. Because I think that, as Eddie put it, one of the things that is true is that when someone is your rabbi, or you grow up in a certain synagogue, you have a notion that, as it were, the way it is where you are is the way it is everywhere else. And on the one hand, that can lead to, at times, an inflated sense of grandeur on people's parts. But on the other hand, sometimes you don't really fully appreciate the importance of a figure in your own community towards the larger world. As our tradition puts it, ein navi be'iro, there's no prophet, P-R-O-P-H-E-T, I want to make sure that's clear, no prophet in his or her own city. But the reality is Harold Schulweis really was a prophet and a teacher for all of American Judaism. And in this Shabbat, where we honor his legacy, what I'd like to do would be to talk about not only the directions in which he led our people in the 70s, 80s, 90s, into the 21st century, but to indicate why his influence was so great. And I want to also talk about what I think were some of the prescient positions that he took that have now come to be accepted by and large in all sorts of directions in American Jewish life. And finally, to talk about what I think the impact and future of denominationalism in general will be in North America, and perhaps the conservative movement in particular. By the way, when Rabbi Feinstein mentioned the Look magazine article, one thing I'm often fond of contemplating when I think about this article, The Vanishing American Jew, and Look's prediction that by the end of the 1980s there would be, in quotes, no more American Jews. If you reflect on it, we're all here, our children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and I don't think I see Look magazine anywhere. So that is a reflection of sorts, and I'll let you think about that. What I would like to do this morning, though, then, in putting Rabbi Schulweis within a certain historical context, is to rehearse certain biographical facts about his life, facts that are probably known to many of you, but I think it will help us contextualize who he was. And then I want to look at parts of two essays that Rabbi Schulweis wrote, The Pendulum of Pluralism and The Strangers in Our Mirror, Jews by Choice. Because one has to keep in mind that 35, 40 years ago, Rabbi Schulweis was writing these articles. And this was prior to a time of overwhelming crisis in American Jewish life. It was prior to, I don't want to say the demise, that would be too strong a word, too hyperbolic, but I would say the decline of denominationalism in American Jewish life. And it was also prior really to the growing legion of intermarriages that North American Jewry now has to confront. Rabbi Schulweis had already established policy directions for the North American Jewish community 3 and 4 decades ago, which have now come to be the common property of many, many Jews. And the truth is, he played really a very seminal role in moving American Judaism, North American Judaism, in a certain direction. As many of you know, Rabbi Schulweis himself was descended from immigrant Eastern European Jews. He was often fond of telling me that his grandfather and father, who were strong socialists, Yiddish writers, nevertheless desired that he receive a traditional Jewish education. As he told me on more than one occasion, his grandfather, who he describes as being militantly non-religious, nevertheless said to Rabbi Schulweis's father, I'm not particularly concerned about what Harold believes as he grows up, but I don't want an Am Haaretz. I don't want an ignoramus. And therefore he insisted that Harold be sent to a yeshiva katana, a day school, a yeshiva day school as a boy. And as you also know, he ended up graduating from yeshiva college. That does not mean that his penchant was ever genuinely Orthodox, but what I do want to point out is that he grew up in what today we would call a very thick Jewish culture. He was Yiddish speaking, Hebrew texts were presented to him as a young child. He grew up in an Orthodox educational system that emphasized elements of ritual observance. All of these elements were part of his patrimony, and they were genuinely second nature to him. They situated him very, very much within a strong Jewish context. And in many ways, while his education was probably deeper and richer than many persons in his age, he was not all that unusual for people who grew up in the 40s and 50s who were children and grandchildren of immigrant Jews. Part of what we need to confront as we talk about American Judaism today and consider Rabbi Schulweis's legacy are what the contextual changes are. Namely, children of immigrants, by and large, maintain a very strong sense of ethnic identity, precisely what Rabbi Feinstein spoke about. I know myself, I grew up as a Jewish boy in the 50s and 60s in Newport News, Virginia, not exactly a bastion of Jewish life. I don't think anyone would describe the world I grew up in as one that would be an Ir v'Aim b'Yisrael, a mother city among the Jewish people. But among the approximately 700 Jewish families that grew up in the city where I lived as a boy, I did not know one person who did not belong to a synagogue. By the way, in a city with 700 Jewish families, 2,000 Jews, there were 4 synagogues. Knowing what I now know about Jews, the only thing surprising is why weren't there 25? Why weren't there 701 synagogues? One synagogue was Orthodox with a mechitza. One had a yeshiva university-trained rabbi, but the seating was mixed. Another was a conservative synagogue, and finally a Reformed temple. I indicate that because in the world I grew up in, I did not know one Jew who did not belong to a synagogue, who did not belong to the Jewish Community Center. My father's attitude towards the United Jewish Appeal, he simply said, yes, we have to make contributions every year. This is just our Jewish tax. The point that I want to make is that for the children and grandchildren of immigrants, or certainly the immigrants and their children, to participate in a Jewish world and to be part of it was, as it were, a muvan me'elav. It was, as it were, a habit of the heart. It was something they breathed in, and the idea that one would be anything other than Jewish or do anything other than support or participate in the Jewish community would have been really unthinkable. In addition, on a social level, well, let me just ask you, there need to be 2 variables present for there to be a high rate of intermarriage for any minority group. Any ethnic or minority group that has a high rate of intermarriage, let's say in American society, but it could be anywhere, what are the 2 variables that have to be present for there to be a high rate of intermarriage for an ethnic group? What about the ethnic group itself? What would have to be true about them? First, they themselves have to be acculturated into the larger world. People like my grandparents who came from Eastern Europe and spoke a language to me, to themselves they spoke Yiddish. To me, they spoke a language I call Yinglish. It was sort of an admixture of Yiddish and English. Those people tend to marry other people who speak their language. In general, when people get married, in general, they do speak the same language. Though there can be misunderstandings as that language is expressed. I'm looking to my wife right now. Children of immigrants tend not to intermarry. The reality is, in the 40s and 50s in the United States, Jews had internalized an ethos that saw intermarriage from a sociological perspective as a taboo. It was something negative. And members of the larger culture did not see Jews as desirable marriage partners. By the way, by the 1980s, that had completely changed. One point Rabbi Schulweis always made to me is that we Jews were always fond of thinking of our history in lachrymose terms. That is to say that it's a history of one persecution after another. There is certainly some truth in that, and all of us know the common trope for holidays. They tried to kill us. We survived. Let's eat. A common theme. But the truth is, prior to the 1960s, Jews were not deemed desirable marriage partners. By the 1980s, when Gallup did a poll of Caucasian Americans and asked the question, how would you feel if your child married a Jew? Caucasian, non-Jewish Americans. The question was asked, how would you feel if your child married a Jew? 1, I'd be extremely happy. 2, it would be fine. 3, I wouldn't like it. 4, I would hate it. What percentage do you think answered in the first 2 categories? People almost never get this right. Jewish audiences. 1986. What percentage do you think said, I'd be elated if my child married a Jew? I'd be very happy. No, actually only about 25% said they'd be very happy. How many do you think said they'd be happy? Yeah, you get another 60%. 86% of people who answered, Caucasian Christians, non-Jews in North America, said they'd be quite happy if their children married Jews. You cannot get a significant element of intermarriage for any ethnic group until the group has become completely acculturated. We're speaking now sociologically, and people in the larger group see these people as desirable marriage partners. By the way, there is a group in North America today, recent Pew studies, that has a higher degree of intermarriage than Jews have. Indian Hindus. Indian Hindus, their children, when they come to North America, intermarry at almost an 80% rate. They'll go to Williams, Columbia, UCLA, et cetera, and they meet Caucasians, Jews, and others. Actually, 2 of our friends this year had children, Jewish friends, who married, their children married Indian Hindus. I have told my friends their children are part of a cultural phenomenon in North America. But I bring this up because if we're going to understand the role that Rabbi Schulweis played, there are ways in which Rabbi Schulweis anticipated all of this and painted a picture of Judaism that would be acceptable in an open society. By 1970, to give you an idea of what these figures mean, well, by 1965, the percentage of Jewish intermarriage, Jews marrying people born non-Jewish in North America, was less than 5%. If any of you come from a family where there was an intermarriage prior to 1965, that is sociologically an unusual phenomenon, not completely unheard of, but virtually unheard of. By 1970, Jews who married between 1965 and 1971, and Rabbi Feinstein mentioned all the transformations that were taking place, 29% of Jewish marriages involving Jews between 1965 and 1971 were Jews married to people who were born non-Jewish. It is in 1970 that you begin to get the first significant sociological transformation. By 1990, the figure had risen to over 40%. By 2000, about 52%. And in the more recent Pew study, for non-Orthodox Jews, 60% of marriages conducted between 2001 and 2012 that involved a Jew, 60% of these marriages, Jews married people born non-Jewish. Part of the reason why this has come to be such a significant element on the community's agenda is that you began to have a complete demographic shift from many of the attitudes and realities of the world in which I grew up, in which some of you in this room who are older than me grew up. This represents a context for understanding. In one moment, we'll take a look at it, the writings of Rabbi Schulweis on this topic, and keep in mind, he wrote on this 30 and 40 years ago. The other difference is that, and I alluded to it earlier, of issues of membership, denominations within the Jewish world. In general, the 1900s saw the dominance, by and large, of the American conservative movement. Part of the reason for that, religiously and in terms of denominational affiliation is in the 19th century, you had a huge influx of German-speaking Jews to this country. Anyone here descended from Jews who came from Germany in the 19th century? Okay, there we've got a few. How many are descended from people who came from Eastern Europe between 1880 and 1920? I think you can see what the difference is right here. Part of the point I'd make is that the creation of these German Jews ultimately, through the leadership of men like Isaac Merwise and others, was the American Reform movement. The American Reform movement became, as it were, both the elite and folk expression of German American Jews who came to this country. Non-nationalistic, tremendous emphasis on decorum, no attention paid to Jewish dietary laws. The Eastern European Jews came over, and they brought with them very, very different folk attitudes. But one would be mistaken if one were to think that these Eastern European Jews who came over were genuinely Orthodox. That is to say, they were traditional. And many of you here undoubtedly think that your grandparents and great-grandparents were Orthodox. But if it came to something like, I either have to work on Saturday or I will not earn a living, most of these people worked on Saturday. I contrast that, by the way, to Hungarian Orthodox Jews who came over after World War II. And if the choice for them was working on Saturday or starving, they would have chosen starvation. The other thing is that in an Orthodox lifestyle, there are, by and large, three major requirements. There are more. One, of course, would be observance of Shabbat and holidays. Two would be observance of Kashrut. And three would be observance of Taharat HaMishpacha, laws of family purity. Charles Liebman, an historian sociologist who taught at Yeshiva and at Bar Ilan, once pointed out that when you had over 1 million Jews living on the Lower East Side who were of Eastern European descent, there were less than 700 mikvaot. According to Halakha, I think all of you know this, I'm not a biologist, but I'll just relate this. According to Halakha, during the time of month when a woman has her period, she and her husband are not permitted to touch one another. After she completes her menstrual period, her cycle, she has to go to the mikveh at night with a great deal of tzniut, humility, and then she and her, at the end of her period, then she has to count 7 days, and then she goes to the mikveh. This is the opposite of the rhythm style of contraception. One reason why Orthodox families have such large groups, if you don't use birth control and you begin to have sexual relations at this time of month, you can produce a lot of children. There is no question about that. He calculated that if you think that there were approximately 250,000 families, if they'd been going 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, they still couldn't have, with less than 700 mikvaot, handled even 20% of these families. The key point that I want to make to you is that the Eastern European Jews who came over had a much, much different cultural trajectory than the German Jews. They believed in Jewish nationalism. They wanted kashrut at least in their synagogues and in their homes. What they did outside their homes was another issue. They wanted a traditional kind of service. But the key point that I want to make here is they were not genuinely Orthodox. Because had they been genuinely Orthodox, they would have observed all of these different mitzvot. In addition, they were as anxious to participate in the life of the larger world as were their German Jewish brethren who came before. The main cultural characteristic of Western Jews has been their desire to participate in the life of the larger world. As my teacher at Columbia University, Arthur Hertzberg, once put it, Jews did not walk, they ran out of the ghettos. They could not wait to participate in Western life, and why not? It's not so bad. Think of what it would be like to live in a shtetl in Europe and then look at the lives that we have here. They chose to send their children, by and large, to public schools when they had a choice. And in fact, economically, they were unable to really create even a day school system. So when people like the Fortis family came to Memphis, Tennessee, they sent a man like Abe Fortis to Southwestern at Memphis, not to a yeshiva, or the Goldberg family in Chicago don't send Arthur to a yeshiva. They send him to Northwestern Law School, where he graduates as valedictorian at the age of 21. Jews wanted to participate in Western life. The creation of the movement with which these Jews identified that allowed them to remain traditional without being completely Orthodox, and that introduced mixed seating where men and women could sit together, was the conservative movement. That meant by 1970, when you began to have for the first time a significant amount, sociologically speaking, of intermarriage in the community, the conservative movement was by far the dominant movement in American Jewish life. When Jews were asked, how do you self-identify? In 1970, 50% of the Jews in North America identified as conservative Jews. About 30% identified as Reform. By 1990, thank you. By 1990, the figures were 41% of Jews in North America said they were conservative, 40% said they were Reform. Almost no one still up to this point said they were just Jewish. By 2002, that changes, and by 2012, any of you know in the recent Pew study what the figures are? How many identify as conservative? Yeah, that's pretty good. You've rounded it off. 18% of Jews in North America identify as conservative, 35% identify as Reform. The most amazing statistic is that today, 26% of Jews identify as just Jewish. They don't identify with any denomination at all. The key point out of all of this long introduction to Rabbi Schulweis's thought is that Rabbi Schulweis himself was the product of a certain kind of Eastern European Jewish family life in North America. But the other point that I think is crucial for you to understand is that he was always appreciative of what the larger trends were in North American Jewish life. One other point I would make, he often discussed with me the thought of Solomon Schechter. Who was Solomon Schechter? Yes, so before he became a day school, he was actually a person. So Rabbi Schechter lived from 1850 to 1915, and he came to North America to become the head of the Jewish Theological Seminary. He was a Romanian-born Jew, and he was the preeminent Jewish studies scholar in the entire world. Lewis Marshall, the Oakes family, Sulzberger, all Reformed Jews who belonged to Temple Emmanuel, ran the board then of the Jewish Theological Seminary. They wanted, though, a traditional English-speaking rabbinate that could speak to the Eastern European Jews who would come here, and therefore they put their money into JTS, not just HUC, because they wanted to be able to help these immigrants acculturate, which is what they desired to do, into North American life. So one of the great ironies of American Jewish history, and when I was a student at Columbia and JTS in the 70s, there used to be all these pictures, Eddie may remember it, of all the early donors who were supporters of the seminary, and I'd say 95% were members of Temple Emmanuel in New York City. Again, just another irony of American Jewish history. They brought Schechter to this country because Schechter was the most prominent academic in the entire world in Jewish studies. He was teaching at Cambridge University, great scholar of the Geniza. A great deal has been written about that. But the other point that I'd make is that Schechter articulated the ideology that came to mark American conservative Judaism. And Rabbi Schulweis was very aware of this. There were two major positions that Rabbi Schechter put forward in articulating his ideology of conservative Judaism. One was a commitment to Jewish law, halakha, but to understand it in quotes in non-fundamentalistic terms. It wasn't that all of Jewish law was literally revealed by God to Moses at Mount Sinai, but rather the tradition How many of you here have heard of positive historical Judaism? Okay, well, I have, so that's why I'm up here. Positive historical Judaism was a phrase that was coined by Zachariah Frankel. How many have heard of Zacharias Frankel? Okay, he really is the founder of the conservative movement ideologically. He was a rabbi in Germany. Frankel believed that in studying the history of Judaism, law was always at its core and at its center. To create a Judaism that would not have halakha or Jewish law at its core was to create something that never was and therefore never ought to be. So therefore, it was the study of history that positively revealed that law was the essential characteristic of Judaism. Conservative Judaism became halakhic Judaism and devoted to halakha and law because the study of history indicated that law was always the chief characteristic of the Jewish religious tradition. In that sense, it was opposed to Reform Judaism, though it did agree that Judaism evolved historically. But there had to be a commitment to Jewish law. The other commitment that Schechter had was to Knesset Israel, or Klal Yisrael, the totality of the Jewish people, Catholic Israel, but Catholic not understood as the church, but as universal. The key point that Rabbi Schechter made was that authentic Judaism, conservative Judaism, had to be based on these two poles. The pole of commitment and fidelity to Jewish law on the one hand, and the other twin pole was a commitment to the Jewish people themselves. For over 60 to 70 years, this worked very, very well. As long as you had children and grandchildren of Eastern European immigrants who had a certain reverential attitude towards tradition, and you did not have, in quotes, high rates of intermarriage, conservative Judaism dominated in North America. Rabbi Schulweis's own position, and I don't know if anyone has really written on this, but in the conversations I had with him, he felt, as he often did, that one had to moderate between these two poles. He was not in favor of rejecting either pole, but he thought that the conservative movement's leadership, in large measure in the 70s and 80s, made a gigantic mistake in not paying more attention to what it is that the people were doing. In other words, from an ideological standpoint, there had to be fidelity to Jewish law, but there also had to be attention paid to people themselves. And how is it that the Jewish tradition would come to view that? All of this is a background that I'm attempting to create for you to understand then the significance of Rabbi Schulweis and the particular essays that we're going to read today. In other words, Rabbi Schulweis was part, it's true, of an immigrant generation. He was educated with a tremendous degree of Jewish knowledge. He was part of a thick Jewish culture in every single way. Simultaneously, he was exquisitely sensitive to and aware of all the changes that were beginning to mark American Jewish life in the 20th century, that we were moving from a community of children and grandchildren of immigrants to a fourth, fifth, and sixth generation American Jewish community that no longer had the type of fidelity to a thick Jewish culture that had been true of earlier generations. And simultaneously, he was quite aware that the kind of denominational identities that people grew up with in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, which Mark, I'm sure many of us in this room, was not destined to hold as Jews moved into the 21st century. Secondly, he was exquisitely sensitive to the reality that the Jewish people was becoming more and more pluralistic and ethnically diverse. As you begin to have higher rates of intermarriage, note, if you have even a 33% intermarriage rate, it means half your families are intermarried. I'll see if I can do this mathematically. I'm not so good. You have 3 born Jews. 2 of them marry one another. This Jew marries a born non-Jew. This Jew marries a born non-Jew. If you have a 33% intermarriage rate, 2/3 of your families are intermarried. Earlier this year, I spoke at Yeshiva University to a class that my colleague, Richard Joel, the president, was teaching. And even there, where every single student, by the way, had 12 years of day school education and a year in Israel, they were students at Yeshiva College in Stern. When I asked the question, how many of you have a grandparent, first cousin, aunt, or uncle who's non-Jewish? This is at Yeshiva. Every single student raised their hand. Well, when you begin to get a 60% intermarriage rate, you're talking then about 80% of your families where we have children and grandchildren who grow up with first cousins, aunts, uncles, grandparents who are non-Jewish. That does not mean the demise of the end of the Jewish people. It does mean that the kind of ethnic homogeneity that formerly marked the Jewish people and the Jewish community is no longer present. And it is part of what led Rabbi Schulweis, at least in private discussions, and to some degree, as I'm about to point out in the policies he advocated, to say that the Jewish community could not hide its head in the sand and pretend that these differences were not occurring, and that in fact he would assert, and he did assert, that there was a Jewish mandate, that probably the most significant mitzvah in the tradition, or certainly one of them, and he would often quote an Orthodox rabbi named Eliezer Berkovitz on this point, was Ahavat Yisrael, the love of the Jewish people. And the love of the Jewish people meant that one had to embrace all Jews where they were. I also know that from my discussions with him, he was completely opposed, quite frankly, to what he labeled an adjectival Judaism. An adjectival Judaism. That meant a Judaism where the adjective, Orthodox, Reform, Conservative, Zionist, was more important than the noun, which is to say Judaism or Jew. Rabbi Schulweis was completely committed to the totality of the Jewish people. So it's in light of that that I want to look at two writings of his very, very quickly. We're obviously not going to be able to read all of them. This is taken from a book of his essays. The first I want to look at is The Pendulum of Pluralism, and we'll see Rabbi Schulweis's own words. But this is the kind of thinking that led Rabbi Schulweis to advocating innovations in Jewish life like the Chavarot, that led him to seek an active outreach department, that led him to be inclusive of GLBTQ Jews, that led him to say we need to consider how it is that righteous Gentiles have aided the Jewish people throughout history and we have to care for them, that led him to any host of positions, the Jewish World Watch, that represented our response, our community's response to Darfur. And you need to understand that his teachings were not confined to B'nai Abraham in Oakland, nor were they confined to Valley Beth Shalom here in Encino. They had echoes throughout the Jewish world, and for young Jews like me, who were members of the New York Havurah in the 1970s, the writings of Harold Schulweis were really very central in helping us to forge our own positions in regard to Judaism and Jewish life. The speech here, The Pendulum of Pluralism, was actually a commencement address that he delivered here at Hebrew Union College, I think in the 1980s. Bert, do you know that? 2006, so even later. But he had certainly begun to express these views earlier on, and I'm happy to say that I was even the president then and was able to confer an honorary doctorate upon Rabbi Schulweis. He begins by noting that there's a Talmudic phrase, when you see a great group of Jews, a large group of Jews, you happen to be a great group as well, but a large group of Jews, you're supposed to recite a blessing, praise to you, O Lord our God, ruler of the universe, Yodea Razim, God who knows secrets. Because each and every person has a different way of understanding how they are in the world. But Rabbi Schulweis understood this blessing to mean that Judaism was by nature pluralistic, that there were, as it were, shivim panim laTorah. There are 70 faces to Torah. Just as each one of you here today undoubtedly hears all these words of brilliance and insight in different kinds of ways, the reality is all of us react to words, all of us react to deeds and context in ways that overlap and that simultaneously are distinct. Rabbi Schulweis on page 16 in the second paragraph says, the benediction is easier said than lived. It is one thing to acknowledge pluralism, it is another to acknowledge it as a blessing. The point I made before, that for Rabbi Schulweis, what the people did was for him a blessing. He was not the type to schrei Gewalt and say, oh, isn't it too bad that our community's moving in those directions? Rather, Harold Schulweis saw pluralism and the inherent respect that pluralism demands of the other as being inherent to a religious posture in general and Judaism in particular. I want to be quite clear here. It does not mean that it's a relaxed pluralism in which every attitude is equally valid. But it does mean an inherent respect for the different positions that people put forth. On page 17, on the other side of the page, he points out the deeper challenge of pluralism is not external, how to maintain housekeeping in an ark filled with lions and lambs, hawks and doves, orthodox and non-orthodox, etc. If I can attain the goal of unity and diversity within, it may serve as a clue to appreciate the blessing of a pluralistic society without. And then he goes on to describe, I know myself to be a person of many moods and dispositions. I am alternatively optimistic and pessimistic, liberal and conservative, hawkish and dovish. There was a film a number of years ago that Rabbi Schulweis described to me. I'm trying to get so much in this hour. I think it's called Crash. Any of you see the movie? So I think in the movie Crash, if I remember it correctly, every single protagonist in the movie performs an act of absolutely horrific evil. They behave in a heinous manner. And in another scene in the movie as it evolves, every one of those people who at one moment behaves horribly, behaves later on in an angelic, noble, heroic fashion. Obviously, we wish people always behaved in the latter than in the former way. But the key point that Rabbi Schulweis derived from it, and I agreed with him, so of course he was right, is that it represents the pluralism that exists within all of us as human beings. There's a Yetzer Tov and a Yetzer Ra. There's the part of us that's good and noble always, and there's a part of us that doesn't represent always the best, as it were, of who we might want to be as persons. And yet the reality is we have to embrace both of these parts and to embrace people in their wholeness. On the next page, page 18, you can see how he labeled the issue of denominationalism. He has a phrase, denominationalism and idolatry. Polarity lies, quoting Heschel, at the heart of Judaism. Absolute antithesis is alien to the Hebrew mind. Rather, what Judaism puts forth then is a philosophy, as he would put it, of the pendulum. Within Judaism, he said, what has always allowed us to live is that there are people who take stringent and there are people who take lenient positions. But what we need to do is ultimately embrace people in both of these ways and to understand that when the pendulum swings one way, at one time, over the course of years, it's likely to swing back the other way. And that the wisdom of Judaism is to understand that what there always needs to attempt to be in Jewish culture and society is an attempt to define that pendulum and to reach a golden mean, a shvil hazahav, a res media, whichever language or phrase you wish to use. And he concludes this speech, and because of time I won't go through more of it, but you should read it later, with talking about how the halachic dispute between Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam was decided about how to hang the mezuzah. One rabbi said it should be completely vertical, and the other rabbi said it should be horizontal. Hard to believe, two Jews, and they wouldn't agree on something. So as a result, how do we in fact hang the mezuzah? Yeah, we just have the rabbis ultimately effectuated a compromise. So we do it, as it were, kind of sideways. That, for Rabbi Schulweis, represents the brilliance of Judaism. The key point that emerges here is that in a world where fewer and fewer Jews, or let me put it in another way, where more and more Jews are defining themselves as just Jewish, where more and more Jews are defining themselves as just Jewish, the world in which I grew up, in which most of you in this room grew up, where denominationalism was quite strong, it just will not mark the Jewish people in the 21st century in North America. That does not mean, and I speak as someone who is a denominational leader, that denominations are going to simply atrophy and die. It does not mean that institutions like the Jewish Theological Seminary and the Hebrew Union College will not continue to create significant, or the American Jewish University, God forbid, I don't want to leave that out. Don't tell Brad Artson or Bob Wexler. I didn't bring it in right away. I've been in the East too long. What can I say? It does not mean they will not continue to produce extremely significant leaders. And even if you look at institutions of ours like ICAR that call themselves non-denominational, they're still led by people who were educated in these denominational seminaries like Rabbi Brous, Rabbi Andy Bachman in New York, and others. These institutions still have, I would argue, an incredibly important role to play in North American Jewish life. But where Rabbi Schulweis is quite correct, and if we want to understand his significance, he was really one of the first major leaders associated with a movement, in this case the conservative movement, who reached out to Jews beyond all the traditional boundaries. He could speak at the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, at the United Synagogue Convention. He could speak in non-denominational Chavarah settings. People flocked to hear him speak because, one, he spoke with the wisdom of Torah, with a tremendous knowledge and great humility. But in addition, he himself came to understand the significance of what he labeled the pendulum of pluralism. And he understood how important pluralism was, and if he was guilty of anything, he probably had an infinite love, a love ein sof, for the Jewish people. And he wanted to embrace all Jews, and hence denominationalism was not nearly as significant for him, the adjective, whatever the denomination would be, as Judaism and the Jewish people itself. I like to think it's the reason why he would have someone like me come here and teach people like you. The other point I want to make then is this essay of his, and we don't really have time again to go through it, but you should look sometime. It is unbelievably prescient, The Strangers in Our Mirror, Jews by Choice. When so many Jewish community leaders were, and they continue to complain about high rates of intermarriage within our community, Rabbi Schulweis said, do not push your children away. Embrace them, love them, bring them in to our community. He would cite to me at times, he was the first one to introduce me to an essay written by his colleague Gershon Cohen, who was the chancellor for many years of the Jewish Theological Seminary. Chancellor Cohen wrote an essay that I still find to be one of the most inspirational and significant essays written on Jewish life. It's called The Blessing of Pluralism in Judaism, the blessing of pluralism, or the blessing of assimilation in Jewish life, the blessing of assimilation in Jewish life. And Chancellor Cohen made the point that it was through assimilating into larger cultures, whether it be Maimonides in the Middle Ages with Islamic culture, the influence of Hellenism upon Judaism in the Talmudic age, the very term that we use that is at the essence and heart of Jewish faith, the notion of brit or covenant, the very word our Torah uses to describe the relationship that exists between God and humanity on the one hand and the Jewish people on the other is an Akkadian loanword. It comes from the political lexicon of the ancient Near East. The word britu, which was a term that was used to signify an agreement between a suzerain and vassals. From the very beginning, Judaism has taken terms from the larger culture, Judaized them, and strengthened Jewish faith and life. Rabbi Schulweis, in this essay, The Stranger in Our Mirror, Jews by Choice, points out that there are two traditions. There are two traditions in Judaism, that of Ezra and that of Ruth. That each of these stories represents different polemical viewpoints in regard to the issue of how is it that we should come to view and accept the stranger. You'll remember the story of Ezra. When the Jewish people returned initially, part of the people from exile in Babylonia in the 6th century before the Common Era, Ezra was appointed as leader of the Jewish people, some of the Jews who were living in Palestine at the time. He ordered that all of their wives be expelled. Ezra represents, as Rabbi Schulweis puts it in this essay, well, I'll use his term, he represents a racial vision of Judaism. Jews are a racial people, and there was no way for Ezra to even bring these women into the Jewish fold. Ezra expelled all of them from Judaism. In contrast, you have the story of the book of Ruth, which we read on Shavuot, which has come to be the dominant position within Jewish religious tradition, though, as Rabbi Schulweis points out, there are echoes of Ezra and Ruth all the way to the present day. Naomi, the mother-in-law with her husband, goes to the land of Moab. Moab is the eternal enemy of the Jewish people. The eternal enemy of the Jewish people. And I'm going to conclude with this in a moment because I think it says a great deal about Rabbi Schulweis's teachings. Naomi goes into the land. Her sons marry, Orpah and Ruth. The sons die. Her husband dies. She is left alone. Naomi, as Rabbi Schulweis points out, says, "Do not call me Naomi, pleasantness, but call me Mara, call me bitterness." And she then decides to go back to the land of Canaan, to Eretz Yisrael. As she goes back, one daughter-in-law, Orpah, leaves her. And Ruth, in words that remain incredibly, incredibly powerful, begs her mother-in-law to let her come with her. And then ultimately Ruth comes back. Asher Telini Alin, where you dwell, I will dwell. Where you will be buried, I will be buried. Ruth comes to embrace Judaism and the Jewish people. She marries Boaz. And here is a key mystical midrash that emerges from this that represents ultimately the reality of Jewish faith. As I said, Ruth herself is a Moabite. She marries Boaz. The origin of the term Moab in rabbinic etymology, this is a rabbinic midrash. I do not think, I hope it's okay to say this, that it's probably historically accurate, but it's accurate within our tradition. Does anyone know what the origins of the Moabite people are, at least according to the Bible and Rashi? Well, again, I do. Yes, go on, Rabbi. Yeah, Arnie? Good. It's good we have a rabbi here. I'm glad someone knew the story. The story comes, the Moabites come from the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. You remember the story where Lot and Mrs. Lot, that is really her name in the Bible, Eshet Lot, she doesn't really have a name. She looks around, she turns into a pillar of salt. Lot goes up into the mountains with his daughters. According to the tale, they have him be inebriated. After he becomes inebriated, they sleep with him, and they have a child. I think we'd call that an act of incest. Incest, I want to be quite clear, is not a mitzvah within the Jewish tradition. The word Moab, the very name according to Rashi, if you look in the biblical commentary, it means me'aviha hu. This boy comes from her father. The very name of the people of Moab is a reminder that this was a people that was created in an act of absolute sin. Incest is so horrible a sin within Jewish tradition that one should die rather than ever commit that act. What is fascinating about this then is, who will ultimately be descended from Ruth according to Jewish tradition? David. And who will be descended from David? The Mashiach, or the Messiah. Here is the lesson to learn from this. Even the darkest, most heinous deed has potentially a spark of goodness or holiness within it. The problem is it remains hidden. And how is it that you come to make that spark of holiness ultimately revealed in the world? But it also means that the Messiah, if you understand this metaphorically, or literally, I suppose, redemption will come to the world. Redemption will come to the world from a person who is descended ultimately from someone who was not of Jewish birth and whose nation was created in an act of absolute sin. The key point then that should be made here is that the Jewish religious tradition views the stranger, the ger, the gioret, as a person who ultimately can come to and enrich and enlarge our community. The point that Rabbi Schulweis makes is that our task, as he concludes this, is that one law and one pedagogy for the homeborn and the stranger must emerge. The ger is our mirror, the convert is our mirror, the stranger is our mirror. We only have to look at it to discover the stranger that is within us. Yadatim et leiv hager ki gerim hayitim be'eretz Mitzrayim. We should know what the heart of a stranger is because we were strangers in the land of Egypt. For Rabbi Schulweis, his great contribution to Jewish life is that in an age when we can already begin to see not the demise, but certainly the attenuation of Jewish religious denominationalism, in an age that calls not for an affirmation of boundaries that separate us, one Jew from another, one movement from another, but in an age that calls upon us to recognize more and more the importance of Klal Yisrael, the totality of the Jewish people, and the need to go beyond what traditional boundaries have been. In an age where 80% of our families in the next generation are likely to have people of non-Jewish origin within them, we live in a world that calls upon us to embrace all of these persons. Rabbi Schulweis articulated this ideology, this belief, this direction for this congregation and for Jews throughout North America and throughout the world for the past 40, 45, 50 years. All of us are indebted to him. We are all grateful for the directions that he established for us, and for these reasons, his legacy remains not only an enduring legacy, but the directions that he cited are more important for North American Judaism today than they have probably ever been. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, David. Before we conclude, a reminder that you're all invited to come and pray with us now in the Nizhnik Sanctuary, the Bar Mitzvah. The meditation minyan will not be meeting this morning for some of the principals of that minyan are not able to come. So we'll have a minyan this morning in the synagogue. Following the synagogue, there's lunch. This morning it's chili rellenos. We are the only synagogue in North America that serves chili rellenos. They're glatt kosher. The pendulum of pluralism sweeps across and brings you malox. And following our lunch at about 12:30, we will gather back in this room once again for another conversation with Dr. Ellenson. This morning he talked about Rabbi Schulweiss's his communal vision. This afternoon we're going to talk about his theological vision, the ideas that he brought to our understanding of Judaism. There is a tradition that when we remember a teacher, a special Kaddish is recited in memory of that teacher. If I can ask everyone please to rise. First a word of Talmudic learning, and then that Kaddish. Amar Rabbi Elazar, Amar Rabbi Chanina, Talmidei Chachamim marbim shalom be'olam shenemar v'chol banayich limudei Adonai v'rav shalom banayich al tikra banayich ela bonayich shalom rav lo toratecha ve'ein lamo michshal. Rabbi Elazar taught in the name of Rabbi Chanina, his teacher, that those who are invested and devoted to Torah bring shalom, bring wholeness to the world. As it's taught in the prophet Isaiah, all your children will be taught of God, and great will be the peace of your children. And the rabbi said, not banayich, not your children, because they are not only your banayich, they are your bonayich. They are the ones who will build your legacy. Shalom rav lo avei toratecha, may great peace come to those who embrace the Torah, ve'en lamo michshal, and to those let nothing stand in their way. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabba, v'yalmad divrach irutei, v'yamlich malchutei, b'chayechon uv'yomechon uv'chayei dechal Beit Yisrael, ba'agalau v'zman kariv v'yimru amen. Yehei shmei Rabba mevarach le'olam u'me'al maya, yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh, v'yithadar v'yitalev v'yitalal shemei dekudsha brichu. Le'elam min kol bizkrata v'shirata, tushbechata v'nechemata, damiran be'alma v'yimru amen. Al Yisrael ve'al Rabbanan ve'al Talmidehon ve'al kol Talmidehon ve'al kol man de'askin be'oraita di ba'atra dein v'di b'chol atar ve'atar yehei lahon lechon shlama rabba china v'chista v'rachamim v'chayim arichin v'mizona revicha ufrakana mikadam avahoni b'shemaya v'yimru amen. Yehei shlama rabba min shemaya v'chayim aleinu v'chol Yisrael v'yimru amen. Oseh shalom b'mromav hu berachamav yaseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'yimru yaseh shalom yaseh shalom shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael yaseh shalom yaseh shalom shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael yaseh shalom yaseh shalom shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael yaseh shalom yaseh shalom shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael yaseh shalom yaseh shalom shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Shabbat shalom.